Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. Hi everyone, good evening. It's a distinct pleasure to be here at CSM, an institution I respect a lot, all the way from Lagos, Nigeria. Welcome to Beneath the Veil, an exploration of Indigo in Northern Nigeria. I am joined by a stellar team, and I just kind of want you guys to come on up here already. No pomp, glitz, or glamour, just Indigo and Earth. Orma, Osione, Karina, can I have you guys come on up here already? So, we were up in Kano exploring the supply chain of this beautiful pigment, and it was an experience. And what you have sitting behind us here is, I guess, just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more. What we're going to talk to you tonight about is really about how regenerative craft can help build a city. What are the intersections that exist between process, place, and people? And yeah, we're going to take it in all sorts of directions, really. So we're going to dive right in. But before that, we'll do some quick intros. My name is Tushar. I am 16 by 16, one of the project partners. I have tutored here at MA Cities, and the idea was to kind of take learning outside of the classroom and put it in a real environment. And I thought there's no better place than with This Is Us as practice. So yeah, that's me. Thanks for listening to us today. Cheers. I'll be moderating as well.
My name is Osione Tekbuji. I am an artist and co-founder of This Is Us. Founded This Is Us almost 8 years ago with my wife and partner, Orma. And can you hear me? No? Okay, so Osione Tekbuji. I'm an artist, founded This Is Us with Orma, and we are one of the central partners of this project. We've worked with Indigo for almost 8 years, and this is an opportunity to share our story and the stories of the folks on the ground in Kano and Nigeria.
And I am Osione's partner, second half of This Is Us. I think Osi said everything.
Hi everyone, my name is Karina Tanoa Kambi. I am the MA Cities part of the partnership, and also big thanks to Diana who kind of brought us all together. Diana Lopez, but she's not sitting here. I'm based in Accra, Ghana, and I focus on creative spatial research, how creative and craft shapes cities, and I'm looking today at Ghana, but also at Kano, Nigeria.
Cool. So I guess you have the context of who the partners are, but how did this, I guess, motley crew come together? And I'd like also, I guess, your own words. What is this project about, really?
Yeah. So there's many ways to define the project. For me, the central theme is conversations. I've known Tushar for quite some time, and something that we're always talking about is how to bring creative networks together and use that to create value, to improve culture, to improve our lives, and to strengthen community. So around, I think, November last year, we were talking about building, sort of mapping our creative networks and the capabilities that exist within those networks in a way that we could have information that we shared with other creatives and other businesses and different people that we work with. As part of Tushar's work here at CSM, he spoke to Diana, and this project then kind of came to life from there, where we were asking ourselves, can we do that sort of mapping in a Kano where This Is Us has worked for the last 7 years, where we've experienced a particular material which we believe is very special and we've used to create products. Can we look at how the city strengthens that material? Can we look at how value is created from that material? And thanks again to Diana for really thinking about how we could bring it to life and how we could fund it. And we put together a proposal to Maison Zero for funding for it, and we're able to kick something off in March that included This Is Us 1616, the MACT's program, and cartographers Mitsio Motu, sorry. Does that answer your question?
It answers the question.
Super.
Yeah, so that's the context. And I guess I'd also add, though, I guess we live in Lagos, which has particular development questions around it, and very often we have to play the role of the public sector as well as the private sector, like delivering these sort of services, and so very often it kind of gives us the space to think quite largely about an ecosystem and help build one. And so I think the thing that's always been special to me about the MACT's program is that it asks the question of, well, how are cities built? And for me, it's very much about the people, and this is particular to the Global South, I would say. And so it was about kind of toying around with that idea of how a craft practice can be placed at the center of a city, and what would it mean for this sort of craft practice to seep through the city, and then how would the city then look? And Kano's been doing this for centuries, actually. It's an ancient, historical, mercantile city that's at the center of a lot, and so it's not really a far-fetched idea. And so I think that's sort of how the project came alive. So next, I guess, question I have, or I guess direction. We have a project. How do we start? What did we do? What happened next? Arma, do you want to answer?
So, I'm just going to answer it the way you've asked it. Obviously, we need to go to Kano, and what's the team we need? We need cartographers. We need to be able to really map out the city and understand the city. But for me, it was kind of interesting because, like Osi said, we've worked with Indigo for almost 8 years. So I literally had to delete everything that I knew and just kind of come with a fresh mind, understanding that I really want to know more, and from a different context as well. I think the first thing is that we sort of got a different understanding of Indigo from this very regenerative point of view, in the sense that, like, it really is a cornerstone for a lot of activity that happens in textile from Kano. And there's this cloth that we stumbled on that we actually hadn't been paying attention to for a really long time. We've never actually noticed it. And it's called the Tekudi cloth. And really, when we arrived there, it kind of just took our attention because there's so much that goes into the cloth, and it has so much history. And it's a turban that from the Tuareg men wear, the men from the Sahel, and it's worn all across West Africa, and it's all coming from Kano. And that was really interesting to us, so we just kind of went down that rabbit hole and try to understand the process from the angle of the cloth, which really uncovered a lot. I'll let Karina go on.
And I suppose looking at the process from the material allowed us to unearth different narratives. So if you go to the north of Nigeria, to Kano, they will tell you there's only one dye pit. The Kofamata dye pit is world renowned. But through kind of allowing ourselves to stumble across things, in that visit alone, we visited 5 dye pits, of which 3 were operational and 2 had literally died. And it's about having conversations about why that's happening. This is us have been very instrumental in keeping Kofamata alive. But then beyond that, we look at supply chain, but we forget that before we get the dyed cloth, we have the raw natural indigo that sits behind us. And the cotton that's woven over there is hand spun. So every part of this process, there's been some artisan, man or woman, that's been involved in that process. And what's often forgotten is pits are owned largely by families, and they're passed down patrilineally between different families, and women are not involved directly in that process, but they are involved in the early processes. So the weaving video that you see of the women here is weaving the strips that are here that made the piece at the end. And by uncovering that narrative of diversity, it also allowed us to see pits in other areas of West Africa that had perhaps been forgotten, and which led to the project also in Ghana.
So basically, you go to Kano, you recognize that you had been doing design work there that allowed you to enter quite deep into the community over there, but you realize that there was so much more. And I guess, was it a revelation to you that there's an entirely different supply chain going on over there that you didn't have access to, right?
Yeah, definitely. Like Karina said, we've worked, like I said, also we've worked in Kano for 8 years, and we've never ever stumbled on another dye pit. So it was really, really, in one day we actually visited 3. And then I think on the last day or the day before the last day, we went to the Kano State Tourism Board and we're asking them questions like, can we have a list of the pits? Because it seems like there's lots of them. And they literally said to us, there's only one dye pit in Kano. And we can tell you it's Kofamata dye pit. And we don't know why that information is not clear. We don't know why they don't want to share. But we realize that it's a huge industry, and I think I was there last month as well, and I actually had the moment to pause for like 30 minutes, and I was just sitting down and watching the people, and literally there's just so much business going on around this cloth, people dropping this off in numbers, like dropping off 50 pieces of this, dropping it here, this one's doing this one carrying this, the guy on the bike doing that, and it's just like, this whole thing is a whole industry that is not even spoken about. So really it was a huge revelation for me. And then also I think just also trying to go down the value chain to look at the farms and look at the back process of it, because there's one aspect which is obviously the dyeing, but where's all the material coming from, who are the people farming, and then we found out that it's the same nice little community. It's like the men farm and the men dye and the women weave. So it's just this thing that, keeps the communities going, and it's so beautifully designed, and it's the culture. So yeah, that was really beautiful to experience.
So what I'm hearing in general is that there's a tradition that has been going on there for a very long time that kind of maintains itself as a kind of closed loop system, but there's elements of modernity that kind of creep in, right? I mean, you can say that maybe we're one of those elements, us coming there to research, but another stronger element, and this sort of comes from like the political sphere, right, is these Chinese imports, right? I think one of the major things that we found out there was that cheap Chinese imports of cotton, of second-hand okrika come into the city and basically are damaging these systems. And I mean, can you speak towards this at all? Like, does that interrupt the cycle over there?
I mean, it does in more ways than we even imagine, because I mean, those things are always going to be there. Not everyone, this cloth is very expensive, but also just indigo dyed cloth is expensive and not everyone can afford it. And even culturally, people have stopped wearing it, maybe because it's no longer in style, or it's just an expensive cloth for just cotton. Like, people prefer to buy things that are maybe lace or like more decorative. So it's always going to happen. But I think that where it starts to become really unfortunate is where we realize that also the indigo like powder itself that is supposed to be like naturally extracted locally is now being replaced by Chinese indigo powder, you know, and it's still natural indigo powder, but it's the sort of thing where you can make it here and there's actually a whole like community of women that could have jobs and had jobs from doing that, and all of a sudden it's being imported, you know. So it's quite unfortunate, like I said, because that's what forms a value chain, and that's one aspect of the value chain that's literally shutting down because no one is processing that anymore. Yeah, I don't know if you noticed anything else going on.
So I guess from what I've heard so far, there's layers of gender disparity, there's layers of sort of economic inequality, and this is lying below the surface, or let's say beneath the veil of this cloth over here. And the two of you, as the This Is Us practice, have kind of come in as a new system, right? What do you think are the opportunities that exist with you guys as designers, like entering the system, and how might you do things a bit differently?
Yeah, I think the first thing for us has always been to commit to the place for a very long time, where we're not just thinking about trade, but we're thinking about the entire system. We want to understand the livelihoods, we want to understand the people that we're working with, we want to understand the origin of the material. So I think that's the first thing for us, is to pick a place, because we want to be home. So we've taken that approach, where when we pick a place, when we pick a material, we make that material and that place our home. The second thing for us is to have conversations with people that are part of that process, and to continuously ask questions, to understand, because we come with our own worldview of how we define value, of how we define what's important, but it's through that time that we're spending there, we want to understand from their perspective what is important. So I think those conversations where you're arriving at shared definitions is extremely important to bringing about some kind of change, or, you know, we can say we really appreciate this, but what does that mean for them? So really coming to that shared understanding and making that our community. And I think the final thing is to really then, once we have that shared understanding, to start pushing in a direction that we think is progressive, or as we're saying now, regenerative, where we can, instead of only just producing clothing or producing finished products, we can look in the value chain and go deeper and say, can we set up an indigo farm, for instance? Can we start to farm cotton? Can we have some knowledge sharing experiences? And I think that's the approach that we're taking, and that we will continue to take within this environment.
So I'm hearing this word regenerative a lot. Yes. I mean, I'm still trying to understand it. But yeah, I mean, I guess in you guys's or in the exploration of indigo dyeing itself, uh, what does regenerative mean in I guess in this process? And yeah, what could it mean for the city as well? And I mean, that's two questions, but maybe I guess first process. You know, like, can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, I think there's two aspects. There's the process aspect, which is like looking at the process of indigo dyeing and saying how is this regenerative. And it goes, I think, all the way back to farming, because indigo as a plant is a nitrogen fixing plant. I don't know how much we all know about agriculture, but it's one of those plants that puts back what the other plants take out. So essentially, when you do crop rotation, you put something like maize and then you put indigo because you're kind of fueling back what the maize is taking out. So when we take it back to agriculture, that's how we find something like indigo being in a place where we're defining it as being regenerative. And then when you look at the process of the dyeing itself, it's so beautiful because essentially those pits last for, like, you set up the pits, right? And it can last for as long as like 2 years, from 3 months sometimes to 2 years. And it's the same one pit that's just sunk in the floor and you're putting your cloth in there. And you can imagine how that feels for an entrepreneur, for instance, because you've invested these materials into this one pit and you're going back there every day and you're able to dye cloth constantly from the same pit over a long period of time. And then when the thing finally dies, what do they take out all the liquid and they actually sell that liquid as medicine. Because indigo has really serious medicinal properties. It's anti-inflammatory. There's some of the like pellets on the plate there, and I actually had to buy them from the pharmacy, from a local pharmacy, because they're made as medicine. So they sell the liquid, and people travel from far and wide to buy the liquid. And it's no jokes, because when you get there, you see the bottles. It's all bottled, and pregnant women are coming and they buy it because it helps with their labor. And when the liquid is done, you get to the bottom, and there's a sludge at the bottom, and they take out all the sludge, they form them into like balls, I think they're pictures, and they burn it together with some wood or the corn stalks, the same corn that is growing right next to the indigo, and that then becomes the ash that goes back into the pits. So essentially, like, there's no waste. It's what you get out of the pit forms the input of the next pit. And I think that that's the height of being regenerative as a practice. But then I feel like it's not just about the process, it also goes back to just if you take being regenerative in a luxury context as well, it's about being regenerative for like the ecosystem. Like, it's lasted this long because of the cyclicity of it, and then also it's like for the community and for the culture, it all goes back in. The women are doing it, the men are doing this, and it's all like one cycle that just keeps going round and round. So that's what I see as, that's why for me it's a luxury and it's super regenerative. There's many different aspects and ways that you can look at it, but I think that kind of really captures it for me.
You said, I guess, regenerative luxury, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, do you think luxury can help, I guess, regenerate a city in a sense? Is there a link? Because I mean, we're sitting here
For sure.
and we're having this conversation. Yeah.
For sure, because I mean, it's been done in other cities in Europe, and you know, there's different crafts that have fueled tiny cities in Italy. bottegas in Creciato, the weaving that they do, you know. And I feel like it depends on how big it gets and how it grows. But I also think that luxury is not just about, it's about how it grows. Like, how does it even get there? It needs to get there in a progressive way. It needs to get there in a designed way. I think that what's happening there is already luxury as it is. But I feel like for it to be regenerative, there has to be a very kind of intentional way of getting there. It has to take into consideration the people, the process, the values. It has to take into consideration all of those things, because that's what goes back into the city. And that's what forms the city. I'm sure Diana is proud of me at this point, because she's like, "You're talking about the city, finally." Thank you. But yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think in the early parts of this conversation, we were thinking about what it is to be a luxury code, right, OC? And we were looking at what it means to have a code that claims that this item or this product or this process is luxurious. And I guess it looks different in Nigeria, but can you name some of the things? Like, can we like dive in and?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in this case, the thing that is central is this time, this length of time that it takes to grow the indigo, extract it, use it, even just trade it in a particular region. I think when you think of that and how it happens naturally, but sometimes it can be difficult if you're thinking a lot about the time. So that then becomes another way to think about luxury. It's like, well, if you're willing to go through the hardship to get this fabric, then you can have it, you know what I mean? And it's not just about how much you're willing to spend. Or if you're willing to engage with this community and engage with the different aspects and the livelihoods of this community, then they select few people, so women in that community, farmers, who are able to experience this beauty, whereas a lot of us are not able to experience it. Personally, the experience that I have is, you know, this jacket that I'm wearing, the trousers I'm wearing, certain trips that I've made to Kano, where I come back and I'm like, oh God, that place is just so awful, it's so hot and whatever. But there's this multi-layered story that also inspires my work and inspires my life that I'm fortunate to have access to. So that can be another way of defining this luxury, where there are people in that community, because they're part of that community, they have access to it naturally. And there's maybe like 100 people in all of life that have access to it. So that's already luxury, if you ask me.
So the next question I want to ask is, go ahead. Do you want to say something?
So midway through the project, right? Because OC didn't go with us to Kano the first time on this particular project, and we're sharing photos with him and we're sharing the stories with him, and all he had was those photos, and he kept saying to us, guys, how is this luxury? You need to explain to me. I'm looking at your photos. How is this luxury? And so we're having this dialogue, but I'm laughing inside, and I'm questioning, because I couldn't answer him, because it was like, you know, we know what the luxury content looks like, and I'm sure it doesn't look exactly like this, but there's very many aspects of this process that is luxury. And I wanted to kind of like put it out there, or like, because we didn't have the answers. It's like, can you have luxury in an environment that is not luxury, or can a luxury product come out of an environment that isn't luxury? Because I don't think we got to the bottom line of it. Yeah, we don't have the answer to it. It was something that I thought that maybe the audience could help us with.
So hold that as a question that we're going to ask, right?
Yes, please.
Can luxury come from a place that is not inherently luxurious,
Yeah.
let's say, or yeah. So think about that, I guess, because that's something that like is something that we're processing.
Yeah.
Karina, I guess the question that links to you, first of all, I want to get your notes on process, I want to really understand like your perspective on that, because you were there like doing the interviews, and then you also kind of have this larger perspective, obviously, from your research in Ghana. So yeah, can you sort of walk us through that a little bit? And then also, I guess, also bring it back, right? Can luxury regenerative practices help regenerate a city?
So yeah, I suppose I came to the project not from Indigo or from fashion, but from the perspective of creative infrastructures. I'm looking at local and global connections. So Kano is a city, but the villages that you see at the very early stages of production are villages, they're small towns. And through This Is Us, their production is in Lagos Island in Nigeria, but they have pop-ups. So it's about how these different spaces are connected and how the material is the process in which that happens. And so I came to reflect on process and systems and politics in these spaces that sometimes maybe don't feel like there is politics, looking at gatekeepers and how they change narratives and they allow us to see things and they hide it, and what that means more generally for natural indigo dyeing, which is a dyeing trade, and I think that's why it's important to discuss today. It's small batch luxury production because it's incredibly expensive for local populations, and that's what makes it special. And I think also kind of leading on from what you guys were talking about, these spaces are not aesthetically beautiful, but they create beauty. And it's important that we don't understand like beautiful spaces to be pretty. And so at the far right, you'll see the more beautified spaces where there's been higher levels of production and there's global supply chain, but at the exact opposite, you will see pits that are dying that have become literally ruins. And it's how we are intentional about the future spaces, but also allowing those communities to dictate what happens to them. Because potentially they will die or they won't innovate, but it's important for us to let those communities decide and support the process as it goes forward. And I think what we often look at when we look at craft is sometimes we become so embedded in the process, which is beautiful, that we forget the spaces around them and the industries that support them, whether it's hairdressers or barbers or city centres or town centres that die when craft dies. And so sometimes it's important to map those spaces as they change. And I think that's what we also did in the project, not only through drawings and through description of space, but also through sound. We started to collect sound maps to also look how those sounds will change over time. And archival sound, particularly in West Africa, is something incredibly new, but it's not something that's new in Europe. You can find archive sound maps probably of exactly where we're sitting from 15 years ago, and it allows us to track change. So yeah, I think craft can really build cities, but often in context within the Global South, particularly in West Africa, there's not support from the top down for this, so it's very much bottom up. And it's through private enterprise that sustainability grows and is shaped. But yeah, I look at local connections and spaces between, what can be the woman that's weaving in the corner and how that ends up in Amsterdam. And how that village connects to Lagos Antilles and how that Antilles connects to an Amsterdam pop-up and the creation of a diaspora community there. And what all those spaces mean and how that creates like a global future for people that are sitting in Duboya. and also kind of brings in this idea of spatialized justice. So these spaces that you see outside of Kano are not connected. They don't have access outside of mobile technology, which of course is aiding those connections to other spaces. So so Kano allowed a connection for me to look at where this is happening in Ghana. And then I found it's happening in the north of Ghana in a small village that's disconnected from its nearest town, Tamale, by a waterway. For the last 20 years, there hasn't been a bridge. So you'll see it over there. To get there, you have to use a canoe. It's promises upon promises upon promises. But Indigo alone can bring spatial justice to that community. Because if there's increased supply chain, if there's a need and a want from the community, it will allow it to be connected. That small connection can lead to a long-term global connection. So I kind of come from a systems perspective, but I believe that through natural processes and materials really do matter. And they matter beyond what you see behind me, and they also matter for what you see, but it's bigger systems as well.
Thank you for that, Karina. So the answer is yes. Craft can regenerate a city. So I guess as a sort of final question before we open up to the audience, what are some of the approaches that we can start moving ahead with? I know Osione, while we were in Kano, you wrote a small piece on I guess 3 possible approaches. Can you walk us through them? And maybe from the audience, I know we're in a group of thinkers and makers and creators of beauty. So we're here to listen to you as well.
Yeah, I think it exists on a spectrum, right? So there's how we feel when we engage with a new space or engage with a new material. And once we start asking those questions about our feelings, there's certain ideas for change that we have that come out of asking those questions. Where, say, for instance, like, I feel like the environment is dirty and I want it to be cleaner. And the question is, how do you make it cleaner, for instance? So the approaches that we talked just through conversations with you guys, one was this idea of increasing trade with a craft that you perceive to be dying. And the more we're trading and the more there's demand for that material and for the service or for the craft, the more resources are channeled towards that system that you want to change. So that's one approach, is just increasing trade and not really asking any other questions. It's like, I want to buy more of this fabric. Can you produce more? And how much can we sell for? And then there's a second approach, which is what I call like the altruistic or NGO approach, where it's like we start to look at indices or quality of life from however we define it and say, let's improve healthcare, and I'm going to come in with this amount of funding to clean up your environment or to educate or to do this and that, and just intervene based on my own values and beliefs. And then there's a lab approach, which is, I don't want this craft to die. I like what it stands for and what it's doing, but I don't think it can survive in this environment. So I want to take it out of the environment. I want to take the practitioners out of that environment and put them in a more sort of closed setting to think about how to document, how to improve the practice, and then those people, from what they learn, can take that back into their community. I think we've tried some of that in different ways. So within this project, for instance, there was the commissioning of an actual, I think that the prototype was commissioned, so producing the material, the dyeing, that whole trade approach is tested within that. There's also the testing of the lab approach, right, where we had one of the artisans come to our space in Lagos and has been there on a residency for, is it a month now? Just testing and trying out some of these ideas, think about how to continue to grow that craft. And our hope is that over the next couple of months within this project, we'll see how those approaches evolve and what impacts they ultimately bring out.
Amazing. So we've had Orma, do you want to say anything? So I think, I guess on our end, we've taken you through the project. It started off with an idea to, I guess, map out existing networks and then also how these networks connect to our own. And I guess through this sort of very interesting layering of where we are in Lagos, creatively as a creative network, to CSM over here, ultimately to Kano, you see the beginnings of a very, I guess, open-ended question about how our cities might move into the future and what they might look like. And from a development question, the entire time I was questioning who was it for and what is it for, but ultimately we are material and we live in a material environment, and so we have to make decisions about how to, I guess, manipulate that. And so the question that kind of comes out of this talk is really what parts of the supply chain changes first, if it has to change at all. Who are we directing it to? Who are we including? And and is this idea of luxury something that can rest in Nigeria, you know? And is it something that can connect to like all spheres of the city, from a political to a social to a material level? And I'd like to invite you guys to, I guess, reflect on that, I guess, a little bit, ask us questions, or also just sort of like tell us what you think about it. And no bars, you can also ask about the process too, you know. Yeah, so maybe we take a couple of questions or we close. Thank you guys.
Hi there. Firstly, I just want to say to Kano, thank you so much for inviting me this evening. It's been a really amazing talk and a really interesting display. My name's Warren Riley. I am an artist and designer myself. Recently, through a project I've done, I've traced my DNA lineage back to Nigeria as well, so it's really fascinating to hear about the textile techniques of the modern day, but also perhaps what my ancestors were doing as well, so really interesting. I just wanted to not necessarily ask a question, but more make a comment on the question of, can luxury come from a place of non-beauty? For me, I don't know, I find that like slightly offensive in a way, in some respect, in the sense of it just feels like that's automatically discrediting the talents and skills of the people that are producing. And also I think in kind of like fashion history, textile history, if you think of some of the most successful names that have made their names, they come from a place of non-beauty. I mean, we've got the Coco Chanel exhibition opening at Navine. She grew up in an orphanage. You know, Alexander McQueen, one of the biggest names in fashion, grew up in a very rough kind of estate, very similar to mine. And so I think in that respect, that question just feels like it comes from a very Eurocentric kind of viewpoint in terms of where it can't be luxury because it doesn't come from a place that we recognise. And I think that automatically, you know, it just discredits the fact that this is an immense feat of engineering, skill, talent, determination. And yeah, I just think it's something that it just depends on how it's presented, really. And, you know, in terms of these local people and how they who collaborate with somebody of a higher standing in terms of in the fashion industry, I'm putting in quotations, but I guess it's just It would really depend on how they were presented within that industry, who they were going to collaborate in order to produce a luxury project, etc. But I really don't think we should be asking whether luxury can come from a place of non-beauty, because ultimately, that's just down to the beholder, isn't it? So, more of a comment than a question, but that was my thoughts of the talk anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. I do think that the thing was about luxury not coming from a space of non-luxury. So to speak back to what you said, that luxury has been defined in a Eurocentric way, but it's about how to redefine it. Yeah. Said, what does Nigerian luxury look like? And so, in a sense, you're seeing it over here, displayed over here. Yeah, but thank you for that. Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to comment on that notion of luxury again, because I think you're associating luxury with wealth, and I think that's a really mistaken concept, because in fact, I worked with Karl Lagerfeld quite closely when I started in my career, and we've always made it quite clear that what luxury is to do with accessibility and someone having something that maybe you can't attain. And that is luxury, and in this case, it really is luxury. And also, to question beauty, Florence and myself have put a lot of effort recently into working with Indigo, which is like an alchemical process. And I think there's no question of the process of indigo making being beautiful. Where it is, that space, you just look at the vat and see the iridescence on the top of the vat, and that itself, that iridescence that looks like a scarab, is the essence of what we dream of as luxury. So I think that you're associating maybe poverty and our notion of what wealth is with something purely economical, whereas the wealth of this community is a knowledge that we have lost, and that is luxury, the luxury of culture, that is something that only few can attain to. And I think there is no doubt that the definition of luxury is within this process.
Thank you.
Firstly, thank you very much for this presentation. It's been excellent. My name is Dr. Avis Charles. I own a design consultancy and I'm also an academic. It was interesting, the points that were made by both Warren and the lady behind me here. And I have to agree, really. I've been in the fashion industry working at the luxury end for 51 years. In regards to where luxury actually comes from and where it is made, when I think of some of the places that I've worked, and that would be maybe Savile Row in the basement, where a lot of Jewish tailors worked, with the windows darkened. I certainly wouldn't have called that space of luxury, but what was being produced was. And I think that it is a Eurocentric way of actually looking at it. You are talking about a product which is so beautiful, and also where it's actually made. Historically, it's absolutely amazing. I don't think there's any reason why it should move. And surely if you move it or try and do it somewhere else, you lose that. And when you look at Indian embroidery, when Chanel has that embroidery done, they're not looking at the space of where it actually is. It's what is actually produced. And having travelled all around Rajasthan, and you see what comes out of there, and also being in other places like Myanmar, whether it's sitting on a grass mat with a lady that's weaving, the product comes out beautifully, and I think that is what is important. And just one other thing, what you said about cotton. I'm Jamaican. In Jamaica and in the Caribbean, we produce sea island cotton, which is the most expensive cotton in the world. Cotton isn't produced luxuriously, but if you buy an Asadina Laya shirt, you are talking about in excess of £1,000. So I think we need to kind of reframe it. It's not a Nigerian luxury, it's just luxury.
Just before you respond, I think we spent some time in an environment where I think there's the questions that arise are one around the product, and I think we can spend a lot of time looking at the product, thinking about the craftsmanship, thinking about the way things are made in that environment. But then there are people that live there, and there are people that go through different day-to-day hardships in those places. And I think when we talk about like luxury being created in an environment that is, let's say, non-luxury or that isn't pretty, we really want to interrogate that question of the livelihood, right? Like, it can't continue to exist if the livelihood can't continue to exist, right? Like, if people aren't eating well, if people aren't, if the environment is dirty, if people are getting sick in that environment, I don't want to call too much attention to it. As much as I want to celebrate the craftsmanship that's happening there and say over and over again that it's beautiful regardless of how the place looks, I don't want to make that misassociation and glorify that, like, oh, it's made in this environment and that environment is luxurious. Because the reality is that it's not. And a lot of us won't live in those environments, and a lot of those people, given the opportunity, may not live in those environments. And I think it's important for us to ask, as we talk about, can craft help a city grow? Can craft make a city become more livable? That we ask that question.
I would also add that when we're talking about luxury, we were also looking at the idea of codes, right? And codes, by nature of what a code is it's invisible. So when you're touching something that feels luxurious, it's been created by a system of people and processes and place, and that's kind of what we're interrogating over here. It's what needs to change in these intricate systems of people, place, and process in order for, I guess, the product is luxurious. There's nothing to argue about that. It's more about interrogating the codes and then defining approaches that we can start to think about within our own very specific context. And then those are the questions we're asking. So it's sort of not an open-ended conversation on luxury itself, which we know is related to wealth. It's about how the wealth flows into the system in the right way, you know? And so, yeah, I mean, you've raised fantastic points. The question is, what of the access, right? It's an access first question where we're from. That's the question we want to open up, really. I mean, it's the only question, it's the only thing, really, yeah. So yeah, thank you guys for your comments. Okay, so we have a last question or comment or, yeah.
Thank you so much, and congratulations, great project. Loved seeing the questions you're asking in the background presentation. My final question would be, what did the artisans you worked with get out of the project? Did they understand they're part of a bigger picture? Did they just produce the commission? How did you discuss the context, like your research questions? with these artisans for whom it's a day-to-day activity. So what did they get out of it?
So my project is a continuation of the Maison Zero project. It's at the end. And so the reason that that panel is there today is because the artisans in the community asked that I would represent them. Not specifically in their faces, but in their craft and what they do. So their ambition is to increase their supply chain and to continue craft in that community. In the next 10 years, if there's not greater investment, it will die. But it's also about how we build an ethical framework where they're at the center. I feel a lot of, there's a possibility that I could go out today and create something and it doesn't have any longevity and then I leave again. That's not what this is about. It's about representing communities and their interests. And everything on display today is either taken by me, taken by them, or produced by them. So that's how they're shown. I think there's definitely ambition in the future to connect those spaces and the artisans in those spaces to other spaces. For example, between Kano and Duboya and otherwise, so that those artisans can learn from one another and support one another, because there's grave challenges in natural indigo communities, specifically around access to natural indigo, being able to farm it, being able to grow it. So yeah, it is a very good question about making sure that it's reciprocal and that they're gaining as much as we are showing it here today, but also by buying this as products, by investing in natural indigo more generally and just reading up on it, you're adding and supporting those communities.
Yeah, I think on our end as well, when we went in, we actually went in saying that we wanted to produce a garment that could be made at least 90% made in the city that we were working with. So that was a task that we gave ourselves. And when we went there, we also explained that to them. And the dress that we made was made like really simply, just using their codes and their strips and their number of strips, you know, in a very simple way that they can almost put together the entire garment without us. And it was a dialogue between us and them to understand what level, for them to understand that this is something that we want to do with you, and we want to do with you in the long term, and we want to design it in this way so that you can be a part of this project. I think that was really interesting for the women, especially, because, you know, the women, they typically do the weaving, but it was just nice. We all sat down with them and we all explained this process of thinking, and they really, really loved the idea of being able to do something for a long time or just consistent work and something that they could be a part of. We showed them pictures. But also something that was very interesting is the indigo extraction process. When we were doing that with them, I think I went there on my own for that aspect, but I was showing them the cold water process of extracting indigo dye from the leaves, and they'd never seen that before. So there was a lot of, like, we sat down for almost an hour just watching YouTube videos and sharing all of this information, and, you know, and they'd never heard of that process, and it was actually a much safer and a better process for them that they wanted to try. So I think that just the long-term aspect of, you know, the knowledge sharing that is involved with doing a project like this ends up with a lot of exchange that's useful to both the artisans and to us, and it ends up being a project that, you know, we also went in there negotiating prices that had nothing to do with the prices that they usually charge. It's like, we don't want to know how much you charge for this. This is how much this is worth, and it was worth more, obviously, than they would usually get, and they were very happy to do it, you know. So, yeah, it's broad.
I think I'll just add that a big part of the work for us is to continue to engage with the community. Like, we've made these communities our homes, and to be able to build commerce in those communities is where we've always started from, and what we want to continue to engage with. And that's the types of conversations that we're having in those communities.
Thank you, guys. First of all, to the best team. Thank you, Diana. Where are you? We need a huge clap for you. Do you want to say anything? You should.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's been an incredible, really open research process, and part of this was a test for us in cities with how we've been kind of thinking through teaching, how we've been thinking through researching as well. Like, what does it mean to take the question of, like, how is the city involved in productive ecologies? How are they involved back? How do we make the city in all the ways that isn't necessarily architecture or urbanism or particular grids or a particular form of representation and drawing? So we skipped a lot of that as we went into mapping and had these questions about questions of invisibility, interviews around what's said and what's not said, and incredible late night hotel floor dinners, whether it was around design or commissioning or like unpicking the urban myths that we felt were really beginning to shape both the production and the consumption of indigo, but in turn then shape that section of the city, which sounds slightly obscure until we sit down for a longer cup of tea, but that was such a pleasure to go in for the things that we theorized that side of the security gates, and then take them somewhere and into a process where we weren't quite sure what would come out, and to be even more sure at the end that there are these ways of always asking the question, how does this sit in the built environment? What are we perpetuating? What are we building? And what's shaping the things that we consume day by day? But these guys, girls, have been absolutely incredible brains, incredible kind of research partners, adventurers, and also I think this is the beginning of a really long-term project thinking about the built environment in relation to regenerative luxury. So I'm really here for that.
To continue our vote of thanks, thank you to Sadia, star girl producer. She did this. Thank you. Thank you to Maison Zero, our generous funders for this pilot. It's a pilot, there's more. And thank you to all of you guys for listening. Please come and talk to us. We have open hearts and minds, and we want to iterate, And thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Lots of love.